Game development is a monstrously complex undertaking. Whether it's a AAA studio of 500 people or an indie team of 3, every single decision brings with it the weight of hours, days, or even months of development time. When a game has major flaws, it's almost never because the development team is lazy or unmotivated, but rather because they decided that the omittance of certain features or the existence of certain bugs wasn't feasible to fix with the time or budget they had for the project. Game development is art, but it's also business. Don't get me wrong, oftentimes publishers will force stupid decisions down the pipeline, like always online single player or making an otherwise fun game into a live service. Some developers will be misguided in their approach or too ambitious in their overall plan. Hell, sometimes the right game just comes out at the wrong time or gets picked up by the wrong audience. These are the kinds of factors I try to keep in mind when critiquing a game for a retrospective. When a game has obvious flaws, what's the reason behind them? Are they subjective or objective? How much do they impact the quality of the game overall? And that's a key question you have to ask when making a game. Which issues should developers prioritize to ensure their game is as impactful as possible? When asking this question, you have to keep in mind that sweeping changes take much more time and effort than simple tweaks to existing systems. And that's what I'd like to discuss today. Not the massive problems with a game as a whole, but all of the minute details you probably wouldn't consider when thinking about a game's impact. This is often why many game series hit their stride in their sequels. With all of the assets and major gameplay features in place, they can take the time to tweak and refine the small details to get them just right. Tiny omissions in the UI, small annoyances that add up over time, breaks in the pacing, or silly glitches that just take you out of the experience. Today, we're going to see just how many of these easy-to-miss elements you have to consider, and try to determine what aspects of these issues have the worst impact on a game's quality. And to do this, we're going to look at a game that gets a lot of the major elements right, but many of the little details wrong. Hogwarts Legacy. Before getting into the video, I think it would be best for me to explain my history with the Harry Potter series and Hogwarts Legacy as a game. When I was young, my mom read the first couple of Harry Potter books to me and my sister as bedtime stories. As soon as I was able, I reread them myself and eagerly looked forward to each new entry in the series. I was enthralled by these stories and the wizarding world, even going so far as to attend a midnight release for the final book. Without question, I was a certified Potterhead. Over the years, my excitement for the series faded as I felt the conclusion left me content to move on. I didn't go on Pottermore or buy tickets to the Wizarding World theme park, and only saw the first 2 Fantastic Beasts movies, with the second being absolutely dreadful. So when Hogwarts Legacy came around, I wasn't all that interested. None of the trailers made the game seem like anything more than a bland Ubisoft-style open world with a Harry Potter skin. A game set 100 years before the books take place, with combat more reminiscent of a third-person shooter than anything in the series thus far, and a bunch of supplemental busywork, I was all set. Even my girlfriend raving about the game couldn't convince me that it was worth dropping $70 to try out. Then the internet happened. I knew people hated J.K. Rowling for her transphobic views, but it seemed that with the launch of Hogwarts Legacy, the worst of her detractors took control of the narrative and took things too far. Bullying people off of Twitch, mass reporting people who discussed the game to get their channels removed, telling those who bought the game to kill themselves. They weren't activists anymore. They were just a disgusting, angry mob of bullies just as bad as those they hated, just for different reasons. To be absolutely clear, this is only a minority of the people who boycotted the game, but that doesn't mean they should be ignored or tolerated. Many of them also started posting spoilers on Twitter to discourage people from buying the game. While clearly not as bad as the other behavior, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. You can boycott any game you like for whatever reason, but when you start to harass people for playing a video game, or try to make their experience less enjoyable, you're instantly the bad guy. So consider this video a big fuck you to those misrepresenting the trans community by disguising their hate and bullying with the false flag of activism. That said, much like with my other videos, any transphobia in the comments will result in an instant ban, so don't think for a second that this is any invitation to be hateful. Anyway, Hogwarts Legacy is pretty damn good. The combat is really unique, combining the fast-paced dodging and reflexes of the Arkham games with the creativity offered by the wide variety of spells in the series. Exploring Hogwarts is an absolute delight whether you know the series or not. The world is massive with beautiful locations, unique landscapes, never-ending challenges, and surprises around every corner. The story is exciting and intriguing, with excellent acting from the entire cast and even a likable main character, which is pretty rare for an RPG. Hogwarts Legacy is a great time from start to finish. Having said that, you might be a bit confused. With a glowing review like that, how can the game get all of the little things wrong? Truth be told, it doesn't. In fact, the game gets so many small details right in the environment recreations that I'm sure even the biggest Harry Potter fans won't notice half of them. There are certain gameplay features that are extremely helpful. Wingardium Leviosa automatically activating after pulling an object closer with Accio, your character mentioning when you enter a room containing a demiguise statue, or small visual indicators for when certain actions can be performed like completed cauldrons lifting their handles. They're all welcome additions that really add to the game's quality. There are even a ton of little trinkets to interact with, like globes to spin, the joke shop toys, globes, cats to pet, mini skeletons, globes, fountains, and even globes. However, when you have a game so meticulously crafted that players can trace every detail of a bathroom back to its descriptions in the books, the tiny imperfections stand out a lot more and cause you to question why these resources weren't put towards those problems instead. And they add up. What I'd like to analyze today is which of these small problems actually detract from the overall experience. Ignoring core issues like the lack of combat encounter variety, super basic AI, and lazy enemy scaling that makes many encounters feel identical, I'd like to look deeper. We've all met the kind of person who will nitpick every last detail of whatever they're critiquing just to prove it isn't technically perfect, but many small problems are either subjective or inconsequential. So today we're going to use Hogwarts Legacy as a template to see how game developers should prioritize various quality of life improvements and potentially find some places that a sequel could improve on. To avoid turning this video into a ranting list, I'll be grouping these issues into various categories integral to a game's development. Keep in mind that I do enjoy Hogwarts Legacy, so this is more about studying how small inconveniences can affect the player experience and hopefully shed some light on how to best prioritize time spent developing a game. I'll mention a few positives here and there, but the point of this video is to dig deep and find places for improvement. And of course, there will be spoilers. So let's get started with what's probably the first kind of flaw that comes to mind when playing any game. Glitches are both the most subjective and most obvious kinds of flaws players will encounter when booting up a game. They're also incredibly broad. Some are so specific that they're only experienced by 1 or 2 players total, while others are so in your face that they just can't be ignored. Some are silly distractions, while others can make a game incredibly frustrating, and some are even utilized by speedrunners to sneak their way ahead of the competition on the leaderboards. It can be tempting to look at the bugs in any game and question why the developers didn't take the time to fix them, but that just brings us back to the questions of time and budget. If a bug doesn't make a game significantly worse, but a new mission will make a game much better, why dedicate resources to fixing something that doesn't really matter in the end? Of course, there are also plenty of bugs that simply go unaddressed due to time constraints, and with its massive scope and ambitious gameplay variety, Hogwarts Legacy has plenty to talk about. I won't be going into everything, but I'll mention a select few that can tell us more about the inner workings of developing such a massive game. Many of these bugs aren't even detrimental to the experience. For example, when going to a shop with an unidentified article of clothing, the stats are still obscured, but the menu will now show if the item is more or less powerful than what you're wearing, which can help save a trip to the room of requirement. Little graphical problems like your cape standing on its side or momentary glitches in a cutscene are more silly than actually problematic, and seeing a bunch of students lose their pathing for a few minutes before leaving class was hilarious. There are also some areas in the game where you're supposed to be forced into combat, but if you cast the Disillusionment charm before the enemies finish flying in, you can turn a mandatory combat section into stealth. It's a bit silly when it happens, but doesn't really change the overall gameplay all that much. This does, however, lead to some problems that can make the game lose some of that magical feeling. One of those unintended stealth sections led to the combat music playing during what was supposed to be an exciting, whimsical escape from the villains, turning it into a boring, awkward trip home.
It's incredible, isn't it?
These musical issues only happened a few times, but it really shows the importance of a game's score. I also got trapped in a room once or twice with no way to escape besides using fast travel, and someone I know was trapped in a spot that forced them to restart hours of progress. This is always a major issue when it happens, and while it's almost inevitable with a game this big since certain nooks and crannies that trap the player are difficult to spot, it's also one of the most important kinds of glitches to stamp out. More than anything, the glitches in this game are just annoying. There are some fast travel locations that get you instantly attacked, some of the chests you've already opened still glow when using Revelio, the targeting system during combat and even when feeding your pets in their enclosure is inconsistent at best, and the animals you capture don't feed themselves unless you're in the room with them, making the feeding station almost pointless. If anything, these are the kinds of glitches developers should focus on when nearing a game's completion. When the major problems have more or less been resolved and you don't have time to fix what remains, these are the things that add up over time. The kinds of issues that can make the late game feel like a slog or make a player less likely to replay a game. While Hogwarts Legacy is remarkably light on bugs considering its scale, I think with just a bit more time it could have been even more impressive. Speaking of impressive, the recreation of the Wizarding World is magnificent. When talking about the small visual details, the presentation in Hogwarts Legacy is near the pinnacle of the gaming industry. The thought put into these environments and creativity in bringing these worlds to life is beyond anything I've seen in most other open world games, especially in the castle and walking through Hogsmeade. The music feels like an alternate soundtrack from the movies, the visuals are pulled straight out of the books, and the general vibe of playing this game is so specifically tailored to the world of Harry Potter that it's akin to walking into a real universe with its own history and lore, as though it's always existed. Hell, in most cases the Avalanche devs thought things out better than J.K. Rowling did when writing the books. One particular moment that stuck in my mind was at the very beginning of the game. When George is eaten by the dragon, I assumed it was a simple fake out and he'd actually apparated away, destined to show up later in the story. Instead, our character turns around to see the Thestrals driving the carriage suddenly becoming visible. This incredibly small moment informs the player that George is in fact dead, sets the tone for the story, and creatively utilizes the lore in a brand new way. Absolutely fantastic. Truly, the way you're transported into this magical world is an experience like no other for both longtime fans and newcomers. However, it's this attention to detail that makes me question how some of the more obvious issues weren't worked out before release. Why would the developers spend ages making a bathroom identical to one found in the original series and ignore other, more prevalent problems? Because while the wide range of jobs that go into a game's visuals is broad, it's clear that some of Hogwarts Legacy's more obvious problems could have been resolved if those resources were managed more effectively. Though, fair warning, this is where we get really nitpicky and even quite subjective. While some players would prefer the game to have all of the environmental elements be top priority, others, like myself, want the gameplay experience and cutscenes to be the main focus. This section is less about what the developers did wrong, and more about showing that there's always room for more improvement. First off, flying in this game feels slow as all hell. Rather than speeding around the castle grounds and having a blast, even the fastest broom is a gentle cruise through the sky with these cheesy anime lines around the screen to simulate speed. While one of the most disappointing issues, this is also the most understandable, since going fast requires speedier rendering times, and since Hogwarts Legacy is eventually being released on the PS4, Xbox One, and Switch, I understand the limitations. Though, maybe giving the player an option between faster flying with slight pop-in or slower flying with seamless visuals could be considered in the future. The NPCs are also pretty hit and miss. While I enjoy seeing them trying out spells or goofing off, there are so many instances of characters walking through walls, falling through the ground, or losing their tracking when going from place to place that it's impossible to miss. This is a good example of an objective flaw that doesn't really negatively impact the game. It's extremely rare that these problems interfere with the gameplay, and most players won't notice them while running around and completing quests. I think having a school filled with students who sometimes glitch out is better than leaving Hogwarts feeling empty, but without as many bugs. Though when it comes to presentation, the most notable problems are concerning the cutscenes and voice lines. The flow of conversation is broken far too often. Sometimes lines have awkward pauses or characters talk over one another. When that's not happening, the game has a weird habit of forcing the player to walk from one conversation to another in the same room, instead of just making one fluid cutscene. None of this is enough to ruin a scene, but it does feel much more awkward than it otherwise could. like the conversations were stitched together instead of being delivered naturally. There's also the final cutscene in which the Great Hall goes completely empty during your celebration, and there are a few awkward moments where the staff seems to have forgotten what house you're in since they didn't record extra lines. It's not too distracting, but it is kind of funny. Though the worst aspect of the presentation is easily the repetition in certain voice lines. Finding and completing a Merlin trial, noting how cozy Hogsmeade is, and if I have to hear about how inconvenient travel was before the invention of flue powder one more time, I'm going to obliviate myself. The number of these flavor lines should have been tripled at the very least, but even better would have been to make them more rare. I normally have a high tolerance for this kind of thing, but Hogwarts Legacy feels like it wants to be annoying. Still, as mentioned earlier, the presentation is probably the least flawed aspect of the entire game. The achievements of the developers shouldn't be understated. There are many small touches that do inform the player of important information, and this game wouldn't be half as fun to play if it weren't for the joy of exploring the world. If anything, this just shows that no matter how well something is done, there's always room for improvement. And room for improvement is the exact note I'd give regarding the UI. The user interface is one of the most important elements to get right when developing a game, especially an RPG, because it doesn't matter how deep, complex, and enriching your game mechanics are if the player has no clue how to engage with them, or doing so is tedious. Hogwarts Legacy is decent, but has plenty of room to grow in this regard. On the positive side, I like the little icons on the minimap that show whether an item is above or below your character. The pathing when heading to a designated spot on the map is well done, only glitching out on me once throughout my entire playthrough. Small additions like that help to keep things clear when navigating through the twisting halls of Hogwarts. On the whole, the systems in place work fine, there are just a lot of small changes that would lessen the time spent digging around in menus so the player can get back to the action. Starting with the map, I understand certain choices. Hogwarts is a massive school with plenty of places to explore, so it wouldn't be reasonable to use a standard scrolling list for fast travel locations. But while the map allows players to spin the school around, adding the ability to tilt the map would have made it less confusing when selecting between two fast travel points near one another. The limited zoom is also slightly annoying when you have to select one of a few spots that are on top of one another. As far as the functionality goes, since the player is almost never going to walk to Hogwarts or Hogsmeade, clicking those locations on the map should shift the view to that location's own map instead of making it a destination. Lastly, the map has a few bugs that can get really annoying for those trying to complete the side objectives. Infamous foes will occasionally appear when using Revelio after having already defeated them, some of the enemy layers never repopulate but always stay on the map, and the final ancient magic hotspot just didn't appear for me until I was right on top of it. Even when things are working, the inconsistency between what appears when you've flown by it versus what needs to be seen with Revelio can make finishing those last few tasks even more of a chore than they already are. Getting into the game, the overworld UI is decent for the most part. In a game with so many mechanics, it's relatively clear what each icon stands for, and they give you a good indication of what you can do at any given time. The only two changes I would make would be to add two indicators. First, while your mount gets an icon when it can't be ridden, adding one for the broom would be nice. I drank a lot of potions by mistake when trying to use my broom too close to Hogsmeade. In fact, replacing the useless guide marker with the broom or mount when pressing up on the D-pad would have been really convenient. Second, since the demiguise statues can only be found at night, having an indicator next to the minimap indicating the time of day would be helpful so players know when the statues should be glowing. The ability to add map markers for certain collectibles you're unable to reach would be nice too, but I understand that could make the already cluttered map really messy. While not strictly UI, I really like having Revelio relegated to the D-pad for the entire game. For the most part, it's an incredibly useful tool to avoid looking around an empty room for a single necessary object. Items are even color-coded to help identify what you're heading towards. The main issue I have with it is its inconsistency. Some items can be seen from far away, while others require the player to be much closer. The glow around items is also dependent on their orientation in regards to the player, which is really unfortunate if you're at eye level with a flat piece of paper. The demiguise statues being invisible from outside buildings is really irritating in particular. Even a small note about them being charmed or the moon glow inside reducing the potency of Revelio would have been fine, but instead you're forced to break into every home in the countryside looking for these stupid monkeys because the devs told you to. Then there's the locks. The locks are the same color as all of the other interactable objects under the spell, but they look like normal items from far away, meaning you'll often spend time running to a location before realizing you can't enter the building it's protecting. It would have been smart to give the locks their own color, then change their shade depending on the lock level. That way players can easily identify locks from a distance and know whether or not it's worth their time to head over. Speaking of a lack of clarity, we come to the clothing. When trying to find the right outfit or selling items to a shopkeeper, the game doesn't allow you to filter or sort items by rarity or strength. It also never mentions whether traits stack, which is really important for certain playstyles. They do, for anyone wondering, and they're great for crushing bosses. Additionally, you have to sell gear one item at a time instead of being able to select everything at once. And of course, while the game does allow you to choose the way your outfit looks while retaining the stats of whatever clothes you're actually wearing, the appearance changes as soon as you select a more powerful item to take its place. Why spend the time picking out an outfit if you're just going to change it as soon as you get a small boost to your stats? Normally this would be a minor problem, but since new gear is super plentiful and nearly half of all the game's challenge rewards are clothing appearances, it makes those rewards practically worthless. And when it comes to the rewards, one incredibly small change I'd like to see would be the ability to automatically collect all rewards and mark other items as red in the start menu. I'm sure only a few people can relate, but I hate scrolling through long lists of random trivia just to get rid of an exclamation point on the start menu. Same goes for the game auto-starting side missions when I accept them instead of asking. Small annoyances, but that's why we're here. Though without a doubt, the biggest problem with the UI is how spells are organized. While the actual gameplay during combat is surprisingly fluid and works well for a system with so many mechanics, it's also extremely clunky. A strange mix for sure, so let me explain. So the game gives the player access to 16 spells at any given time. Just swap to a specific subset of 4, hold down the trigger, and press the button. Simple, elegant, and offers a lot of variety. Except for all of the wasted slots. The Room of Requirement spells and animal spells are completely pointless in the overworld and yet still take up a few spell slots. This forces the player to choose between having extra utility in the field or the convenience of not swapping spells every time you want to feed your pets. The way I see it, the game had two possible solutions for this. First, they could have simply made the Room of Requirement spells auto-switch when entering the room since there's no reason to use any other spells when brewing potions or tending to your plants. They could have also made the brush and food spells exclusive to the animal sanctuaries. Between these two rooms, that clears up 6 slots, which would allow for a lot more flexibility in the main game. Though an even better solution would be to double the number of available spells. Instead of having the player press right on the D-pad to open up the spell menu, that could have been moved to the start menu, while the D-pad could have been used to swap between 2 sets of 16 spells. Maybe use one for utility like Animal Spells, Reparo, and Wingardium Leviosa, and the other for combat. Considering that the game's combat encounters lack a lot of variety, giving the player plenty of spells to choose from in a fight could keep things more interesting for longer. Plus, it means players are more likely to experiment with different spell combinations, like maybe having one set of damage spells that's exclusively used for bosses, or keeping all the spells commonly used for puzzles together. It's the perfect showcase of how important a user interface can be when it comes to impact on gameplay. And really, that's the point of a UI, to get the player what they need and get them back into the game as soon as possible, to store information for the player to come back to and understand how the game's going to work. Hogwarts Legacy does do a good job of this, but with all of these mechanics, it was bound to have a lot of places where it could be improved, so hopefully in a future sequel we could see some of these changes taken into consideration. I don't think that anyone would argue that small tweaks to a game's core design can make a world of difference. Make the gravity slightly higher and suddenly cliffs that look climbable aren't. Give a surface too much friction and a fun side quest becomes a slow trudge through the sand. While a lot of gameplay elements are highly subjective, there are some problems that can negatively impact anyone's experience with a game. And with Hogwarts Legacy, some of the choices made are just strange. For one, in a world based on magical powers where plot holes can be waved off easily, there are a lot of restrictions that just aren't explained at all. The inability to use your broom during missions, your character being allowed to walk through the restricted section in staff quarters without sneaking after your first mission in those areas, the previously mentioned inconsistency with Revelio, and the one with the most story implications, why don't the villains use any unforgivable curses? All of these mechanics are fine on their own, but without a small explanation of why the game works this way, it's left feeling inconsistent and immersion is occasionally broken. For example, stating that the villains cast anti-broom charms around their camps, or a short cutscene in which you're given access to the staff areas thanks to Professor Fig pulling some strings, would have been more than enough to clear things up. The curses are the most understandable omission. If enemies could win a fight with a single attack, the game would be unbelievably frustrating. But after the poachers use them for the first time in a cutscene, it's strange that even though they're willing to kill children, they're against using these spells in combat. There are two ways to solve this. Either include the unforgivable curses and give them massive tells while allowing players to reflect them back, or just add the explanation that only those with Slytherin's blood or who've entered his chamber under the school can use unforgivable curses on school grounds due to some ancient magic charm or whatever. Of course, the gameplay problems don't stop at under-explained plot holes. Some of them combine a few small issues to make certain mechanics incredibly frustrating, chief among them being the clothing and stat distributions. You would think that a game with only offense and defense stats would be easy to manage, but Hogwarts Legacy clearly didn't think through how these stats would influence the gameplay. And this starts with the choice to only use 2 stats in the first place. In a typical RPG, different clothing items grant various bonuses to either a bunch of stats or give a passive benefit to certain abilities. This means that players would often have to decide which items of clothing are best for the kind of experience they want to have. They could forego protection for more attack, reduce their cooldowns at the expense of utility, and other kind of benefits. In Hogwarts Legacy, not only are there just 2 stats to worry about, but each type of clothing can only affect one stat in particular, with upgrades improving the other. With this kind of system, there's no choice in the matter. If you see a green arrow, you should always upgrade your clothes. The one exception to this is with clothing rarities, since certain rarities can be upgraded further or have higher level traits equipped, but that choice is nearly pointless. You don't really have access to modifying traits until later in the campaign, and even legendary articles of clothing get picked up all the time. Not only that, but gear is random and set to a strength value close to your character level, so you're best off waiting to open chests until you're a higher level anyway. Plus, why would players spend too much time upgrading their gear? While I do appreciate how easy it is to get the materials from your own breeding grounds, animal sanctuaries, just continuing through the game will likely grant you more powerful gear anyway. Plus, you can't transfer traits from one item to another, and upgraded clothes don't sell for much more than their standard price. All of this results in a game that discourages players from engaging in one of its main mechanics. It really shows how even something so simple needs a lot of thought put into it to ensure that it's as good as it can possibly be. Even the damage multipliers don't make sense. Normally your in-game stats have a nearly linear effect on your combat skills. An offense of 10 means you do twice as much damage as when your gear gave you plus 5. Instead, Hogwarts Legacy makes your gear nerfed to the point of not mattering until the endgame. I've put up charts showcasing how offense level affects character damage and defense reduces damage taken. Just looking at offense, you get 10 times basic spell damage at a power level around 275, which doubles at around 340, then hits times 100 at around 475. I get that doubling the player's damage makes a big difference, but when all enemies scale with the player, it results in all of these stat changes feeling like they don't make a difference. Why bother exploring the world and leveling up if you aren't going to feel any more powerful during the missions? This small element of the game creates a massive rift between the two objectives of exploration and story missions, which makes this a good time to mention how the side missions and overworld goals don't really have an impact on the game. There are camps to clear out around the map, but they repopulate after a certain amount of time has passed. This is understandable since it allows players to more easily complete challenges related to what kinds of enemies you defeat, but it comes with the downside of forcing players to redo the exact same combat scenario they've already done, particularly if the game sends them through a previously completed camp during a story mission. It's an unfortunate pattern throughout the game, increasing the quantity of activities without putting in the effort to make them distinct. For example, the Merlin trials have the most variety of any side activity in the game, but even they get repetitive before you've even done half of them. Sure, you get extra gear slots, but that just means you need to travel to Hogsmeade less often to sell old clothes. Side quest rewards should always be about making the game more fun, not less tedious, since the tedium should have been removed in the first place. The final problem with Hogwarts Legacy's design is its tedium. This game can be a ton of fun when engaged in combat or flying over the castle grounds, but it sure does love to waste your time. Somehow, the same game that's so impatient that it gives you puzzle hints 5 seconds after entering a room is dead set on making a good chunk of its runtime repetitive, grindy, pointless, or boring. And nowhere showcases this problem more than the Room of Requirement. I think that having a place where the player can decorate and accessorize with a bunch of items they find out in the world is a cool addition. Harry Potter Happy Home Designer is neat, with potential for even more fun if players can visit their friends' rooms online in future games. However, when you take this feature and combine it with the utility of growing plants, brewing potions, and gathering upgrade materials, you run into a conflict of interest. Take the animal pens for instance. While some players enjoy having their own little chow garden in which to play with these magical creatures, not only are the options to interact with the animals limited, but for those who want to get back to the main game, this place becomes a bit of a pain. I've already mentioned the poor targeting with collecting materials, the possibility of automatically switching spell slots when entering the room, and how the animals don't feed themselves at the feeding station when you're not around, but going even further, why isn't there a brushing station too? That way players who want to pet these adorable little guys have that option, but those who just want their goods can pick them up and head out. Thinking about this even more in regards to the whole room, Deke is completely underutilized. Imagine if instead of getting various clothing appearances for completing overworld objectives, you could instead teach Deke to collect your plants, potions, and upgrade materials over time, with the final upgrade allowing him to apparate to the player to give you a restock anytime you're not in combat. You'd still need all the materials to get these items, but it would completely eliminate the constant trips back to the room between missions. Even the unidentified gear only serves to waste your time. Since all gear is randomly generated, there's no reason to hide stats and traits since it only forces the player to take even more trips to the Room of Requirement over the course of their playthrough. Maybe if these were guaranteed to be at a higher level or have unique traits it would be worth the trip, but even then with their power tied to the player's level at the time they're picked up, they'd soon become outdated. All of these seemingly insignificant problems make the Room of Requirement a prime example of the pitfalls a developer can fall into when combining a space for creativity with one for utility. An otherwise cool idea that instead forces players to spend cumulative hours doing something other than playing the actual game. Of course, when playing the game, you're still forced to slow down or stop constantly. I've already talked about the slow broom speed, but that's nothing compared to how slow your mounts are. Remember in the third movie how flying on Hedwig was so enthralling that it looked like a roller coaster ride? Well, here it's so pathetically slow that I thought I might have missed a line about Highwing being injured. He's even slower than the base broom. While I understand that for many fans, the joy of riding this mythical beast is more than enough entertainment on its own, that doesn't change how pointless he feels when exploring the overworld. He just could have used some gameplay utility. And when it comes to slow, the houses in this game are agonizing. Your character walks at a snail's pace when indoors for seemingly no reason. I'd say it's to prevent the player from getting themselves or the camera caught on more complex geometry, but that happens all the time anyway. Of course, with any open world game, exploration is bound to have its slow moments. These aren't a negative, as they're necessary to reset the player's mood and give them time to contemplate what they've experienced on their way to the next encounter. Still, there are a lot of quality of life improvements to be made in regards to side quests and collectibles. The repetition is a major problem in this game. I've already mentioned the flaws in the Merlin trials, and the other side quests are even more mindless. Smacking the Daedalian keys is no different any of the 16 times you collect a token. Alohomora just works in the books and movies, but for some reason the game forces players to do the same pointless minigame every time they open a lock, with even the different lock levels being identical in their lack of challenge. The ancient magic hotspots all have the same puzzles as the main quests, without any creativity or variety in how to utilize your spells to proceed. I was going to at least congratulate the devs on allowing players to circumvent a few challenges by creatively hopping on their brooms, but even that's been patched out, forcing the player to look for the next inevitable box to lift or brush to burn on autopilot. And don't even get me started on the endless identical caves with elemental box switches plastered all over the map. All of these needed more effort to make them stand out, or to just be removed entirely. As they are, they add nothing to the gameplay experience aside from padding to make the game longer. Even the Merlin trials force the player to watch an in-game cutscene upon completion instead of just giving them their reward. Similarly, the most petty example of this is also the one that first had me thinking about writing this video. When you perform certain actions in the castle, you'll unlock a missing page from your field guide. Use Leviosa on a statue, blow up a torch, etc., and after a second or two, a page will show up and allow you to put it in your book. My one question is this: why don't these pages automatically pop into your field guide? Now you might be thinking that it's just a minor annoyance, and you'd be right, but there are dozens of these pages scattered throughout Hogwarts. Adding this button prompt not only stops the player in their tracks, but it's completely pointless since pulling the flying pages out of the sky does automatically add them to the book, so the functionality already exists in-game. It's the perfect example of a tiny flaw that makes the game just a bit less satisfying to play. And that's really why it's important to consider all of these small details. If a player has spent an hour going through your game and realizes half of that time was spent doing busy work, it makes your game less satisfying overall. It's not the kind of impact that's immediately obvious, but one that's felt over a long play session. And in an open world game that takes tens of hours to complete, you're more likely to feel that impact over the course of your playthrough. Now, while I'm talking about Hogwarts Legacy, there is one topic unrelated to the video that I have to mention. If you're only here to hear me talk about tiny issues in the game, feel free to skip to the conclusion, but this game does something that I absolutely despise and I need to talk about it. Hogwarts Legacy is a multi-platform game with one of its missions exclusive to the PlayStation version of the game. Console exclusivity is a complicated subject. While it is a bummer that certain players can't experience certain games because they're on the wrong console, it does encourage competition and allow developers to utilize each machine's capabilities to their fullest. Even cosmetics are just fun little additions that are usually based on the console of choice or one of their exclusive IPs. This is perfectly understandable and can help some developers get that tiny bit of extra funding needed to make their game even better. Hogwarts Legacy, on the other hand, takes this too far. Not only is the side mission that allows players to own their own shop in Hogsmeade exclusive to PlayStation, but it's the best mission in the game. I first found out that it was exclusive after finishing the quest and texting my girlfriend about it, but she had no clue what I was talking about. After looking it up, I was furious. Now you might be wondering what the big deal is. If Sony paid WB to make an extra mission, it's just an extra bonus for PlayStation players, right? Well, that's not what happened. If you use Revelio on the abandoned shop door on PC or Xbox, the door still glows. This indicates that the mission already existed in every version of the game. Sony didn't pay to have an extra mission made, they paid to have a mission taken away from everyone else. If you still don't believe me, look at the content. One of the longest missions in the game with unique mechanics, characters, assets, and the feature of shop ownership all put together solely for one console? Not a chance. If anything, this took away mechanics from everyone. This mission is so creative and fun that it makes the rest of the game feel bland and repetitive by comparison. It really makes you think about how with an entire Wizarding World at their disposal, the developers really played it safe. Not only that, but all your house elf Penny can do once you open the shop is sell your clothes, but you can do that anywhere. Maybe if this mission were shared by everyone, more effort would have been put into the shop mechanic, and Penny could have eventually apparated to the player to take extra gear off your hands, perhaps as a reward for completing all of the Merlin trials. In short, when a game is multi-platform, developers should do everything in their power to try and make the experience on each platform as identical as possible. Taking fun away from some players not only impacts the quality of the other versions of the game, but it means you've put the short-term profits over the quality of your art. And don't even get me started on Sony. They took joy away from other players for a benefit so small that most don't even know it exists until they're told about it. Shame on all of them. Anyway, let's wrap this up. As stated before, game development is a monstrously difficult undertaking, and the fact that any AAA games exist in the first place is a miracle of the modern age. So when I mention all of these small problems, it's not because Hogwarts Legacy isn't impressive, but because it's like having a luxury car without any wax or polish, and the steering wheel always veers slightly left. Sure, it gives you what you wanted, but there could certainly be some improvements. For developers, it seems like the best way to go about eliminating these problems is to take a month or two after the game seems finished to just go through one more time and see if anything feels off. Ask yourself, if you were to make a sequel to this finished game, what would you change? There are so many potential pitfalls we've seen just looking at this one game. Repetitive mechanics that waste the player's time, limitations to gameplay without valid story reasons, inconsistency or a lack of explanation for various features leading to player confusion, small design choices in the UI or gameplay that add pauses to the pacing or add up to a lot of padding, and much more. These are so easy to miss, but all of them contribute to a game feeling slower, clunkier, or just less exciting than it otherwise could. And if any of you think these issues are too small or don't really matter, I think the developers disagree. If not, why would they patch the Floo Powder locations to be less talkative and make other small adjustments to improve the game post-release? These things do matter, so instead of ignoring them or waving them off, we should try to point them out, so when a sequel is inevitably made, there's already a laundry list of mechanics to iterate on and improve. Because if these studios are going to spend millions of dollars creating a single game, developers are going to spend years of their lives working on a single project, and players are going to spend $70 of their hard-earned money to experience a game, it's beneficial for everyone when a game is as good as it can possibly be. But that's all I've got for you today. If you enjoyed the video, give the like button a little kiss, and if you didn't, give it a hard smack. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see my next video sometime this decade, and as always, have a mighty nifty day today.